They say success feels like freedom. But what no one tells you is how heavy freedom can become when your own family tries to chain you down with guilt. My name is Andrea Kort, I'm 26 years old, and I live in New York City, the place where dreams look glamorous from the outside, but inside it's survival, ambition, and sleepless nights. For years I worked quietly. No vacations, no luxury handbags, just endless hours, climbing from an unpaid intern to a financial analyst earning six figures. It wasn't luck. It was grit, tears, and a version of myself that forgot what weekends felt like. My mom used to say I was too ambitious for my own good. Funny thing, that ambition was what kept the lights on when she couldn't. But when you grow up poor, you tell yourself that once you make it, your family will finally be proud of you. You imagine dinners filled with laughter, your mother smiling at how far you've come, not realizing that sometimes the moment you start winning, they start keeping score. It all began one Friday night. My phone buzzed with a message from my mom. "Heard you bought yourself a new apartment. Your brother and I will come by tomorrow to celebrate." First I smiled. That was before I realized she didn't ask. She announced. The next morning she arrived early. Lipstick too red, perfume too strong, and my brother Ryan trailing behind her, scrolling through his phone like he owned the place. "Wow," she said, stepping inside. "Marble floors. City view. You're really living the life, huh?" I laughed softly. "Yeah, it's been a lot of work," she cut me off. "Well, we deserve to enjoy some of it too, don't we?" First I thought she was joking, but then she handed me a list. Expenses. My brother's rent. His car insurance. Her credit card bill. "I raised you, Andrea," she said, her tone suddenly sharp. "Now it's your turn to take care of us." Something inside me went quiet. I looked at the list, not because I was shocked, but because a part of me had always feared this moment. The moment when love became currency. I didn't fight back. Not then. Because I knew something she didn't. I'd been keeping records too. Not of debts but of patterns. Every time she'd called me selfish. Every time my brother had taken without giving back. Every guilt trip masked as love. And for the first time in my life I realized something. I didn't have to explain my success. I could use it differently. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how family can love you and still drain you dry. And maybe the only way to stop them was to let them think they'd won. Before I tell you what I did next, I'd love to know, what would you do if your own mother tried to turn your success into her paycheck? Tell me in the comments. And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what happened next wasn't about revenge at first. It was about survival. People think money changes people. But sometimes it just reveals who they've been all along. Growing up, my mom wasn't cruel. Not exactly. She just believed the world owed her something. And by extension, so did I. My father left when I was 10. He said he couldn't handle the pressure anymore. That mom's spending, her expectations, and her constant need to keep up had drained him. The day he walked out, she threw a vase at the door and screamed, "You'll see. My daughter will make something of herself. And then you'll regret leaving." I didn't know it then, but in that moment I stopped being a child. Became her proof. Her project. Her future investment. By 16 I was working part-time, saving every dollar while my friends went to parties. By 19 I was paying half the rent. And by 23, when I got my first real job in Manhattan, my mother's tone shifted from "I'm proud of you" to "Don't forget where you came from." The irony was I never forgot. I remembered every eviction notice. Every empty fridge. Every night my mom would say, "We're in this together." But together always meant me carrying the weight. My brother Ryan was different. He never worked a day in his life. He floated from one failed business idea to another, using charm and pity as his currency. Mom called him her baby boy. I called him the reason my savings disappeared twice. Still I kept giving. Because deep down I thought maybe if I gave enough, they'd finally love me without conditions. But love that depends on your bank balance isn't love. It's leverage. When I bought my apartment, I didn't tell anyone at first. It wasn't fancy. Just a small one-bedroom in Brooklyn with a city view that reminded me how far I'd come. For the first time in my life, the silence in my home didn't sound like loneliness. Sounded like peace. Then Mom found out. I never knew how. Maybe Ryan saw something online. Maybe a neighbor mentioned it. But once she knew, peace packed its bags and left. She started showing up unannounced. Sometimes with gifts, like old dishes or curtains I didn't need. Other times just to check if I was doing okay. But I could see the calculation in her eyes. Scanning the place, estimating how much everything cost. One evening she brought Ryan over again. He sprawled on my couch, sipping soda, scrolling through his phone like a bored guest in a hotel lobby. Then Mom said, "You're lucky, Andrea. Some people work their whole lives and never get what you have." It sounded like a compliment, but it wasn't. It was a warning. That night, she told me Ryan had a business opportunity. He just needed a few thousand to get started. Said no. She went silent for a second, then smiled and said, "You've changed, Andrea. You used to care about family." That's when it hit me. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn the approval of people who only saw me as a paycheck with a heartbeat. So I stopped explaining. I stopped defending. And quietly, I started preparing. Because if they wanted to turn my success into a game, I was done playing by their rules. Before I tell you how I turned their greed into their downfall, tell me, do you believe family should always be helped, no matter what they've done? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button because the next part, that's when everything changed. You can love people with your whole heart, and still watch them use that love as a weapon against you. A few weeks passed after I said no to my brother's business idea. I thought maybe, just maybe, the silence meant they understood my boundary. But in my family, silence was never peace. It was plotting. Started small. Missed call here. A guilt-laced text there. Your brother's not doing well. Your mom's been worried sick. Then came the real message. We need to talk. When I arrived at my mom's place that Sunday, Ryan was already there, acting like a victim at his own pity party. Mom sat beside him, holding an envelope. She didn't offer me tea or even a seat. Just that same old tone, sugar on the surface, venom underneath. We've decided, she began, that it's time we help each other more as a family. I frowned. Help each other? How? She smiled. You make more than enough, Andrea. You could easily cover the rent here. It's the least you can do after everything we've done for you. Everything they'd done for me. The words hit me harder than I expected. I'd paid for her electricity when she couldn't. Covered Ryan's tuition twice when he dropped out. Sent money every month for emergencies. And now she made it sound like I owed her more. When I hesitated, Ryan jumped in. Come on, Andrea. Don't be dramatic. You have 2 incomes now, right? I turned to him. What are you talking about? He smirked. Your job. And that side gig you've been bragging about. Mom showed me the photos of your apartment. You're doing great. I looked at my mother, her eyes darting away. That's when I realized she'd been snooping through my social media. She had shown him everything. The apartment, my new car, even the furniture I'd saved up for months to buy. The betrayal wasn't in what she'd said. It was in what she'd shared. My privacy, my pride, my peace. All handed over for a chance to make me feel guilty. When I didn't respond, her tone sharpened. You're ungrateful, Andrea. I raised you by myself. I sacrificed everything for you. And now, you think you're better than your family. That's when something inside me snapped. For years, I'd carried her emotional debts like they were my own. But that day, I saw it clearly. Her sacrifices weren't for me. They were investments she expected repayment on. And she thought my success was her interest. I stood up slowly. I'm not your bank, Mom. And I'm not responsible for Ryan's failures. Her face went red. You'll regret this, Andrea. Blood is blood. I didn't yell back. I just looked at her, calm, steady, and said, "Maybe. But you're the one who keeps selling it." I left her apartment that day knowing I'd crossed a line I could never go back from. Not because I stopped caring, but because I finally started protecting myself. That night I turned off my phone. Texts came. The voicemails piled up. Threats turned into tears. Tears turned into silence. And silence turned into strategy. Because the next time they'd reach for my money, I wouldn't push them away. I'd let them take the bait. They wanted to use me. Fine. I was about to give them exactly what they asked for. Just not the way they expected. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to know. Do you think cutting family off financially makes you heartless? Or finally free? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're still here with me, make sure to subscribe because the next phase, that's when payback starts to look a lot like karma. There's a peculiar kind of loneliness that comes when the people who raised you decide you're expendable. It's not loud. It's a soft, steady pressure, the kind that squeezes the air out of a room until you forget how to breathe. After that fight with Mom, the calls started. First polite. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Then sharp, then ugly. My inbox filled with passive-aggressive messages. Family group chats where my name was suddenly an accusation. DMs from old friends asking if I was really like that. Ryan texted to say I'd made him look bad in front of his friends. My mother sent long, sanctimonious paragraphs about duty and family and how I'd changed. Worse, she began to weaponize the one thing she thought she owned. My reputation. She told neighbors things I'd never told anyone. She implied I was selfish, heartless. A cousin posted a sly comment on my latest photo. "Money changes people, huh?" And people I'd known since college suddenly treated me like a headline they'd skimmed and already judged. Then the financial pressure started the way it always does. Not with fireworks, but with quiet, efficient knives. Ryan's rent was accidentally charged to me through an old shared account I hadn't used in years. A utility bill I'd forgotten to close popped up in my name. My mother borrowed my card for groceries and returned it with a shrug that said, "We'll sort it later." Small things that left little dents in my calm until the dents pooled into panic. I went to the bank to straighten it out. The teller was unable to reverse some of the transfers without a note from the account holder. Mom's name was there, on a set of forms I'd never signed. My stomach dropped. Someone, either through convenience or convenience plus malice, had taken liberties with my privacy. The bank asked for proof, IDs, explanations that felt invasive and humiliating. I sat in that fluorescent-lit room and felt everything I'd built turning into a paper trail of questions. At work, the storm followed. People gossiped in the kitchen about daughters who changed. A junior analyst whispered something about nepotism and I felt the old itch of proving myself, the grind that got me here. HR asked if I needed support. My manager's messages grew distant. Performance reviews were suddenly cautious. It's a strange thing to watch respect erode when your family decides to cash in on your name. That week, I slept on the couch for 3 nights, clutching my phone like a small animal. I replayed every conversation, every dinner, every whispered promise my mother made when rent was late. I tried to count my blessings, the apartment, the job, the friends who had stood by me, but those numbers started to blur under the weight of betrayal. And yet, in the middle of that hollow place, something practical surfaced. Rock bottom strips away noise. It forces you to see the facts. Dates, transfers, signatures, witnesses. It insists you stop crying long enough to document the damage. So I started to do the only thing that felt like control. I recorded. I pulled bank statements, old emails, saved chats where Mom casually mentioned helping out, and where Ryan joked about borrowing my things. I printed receipts. I copied social media posts that proved when and where they'd shown up at my door. I made a folder on my laptop entitled Evidence, and for the first time in my life, I treated my family like a case file. The reality was brutal but clarifying. The people I loved had always treated me as a resource first, a daughter second. Their sense of entitlement had a pattern. Small invasions that escalated into open demands. The pattern created a map. The map showed me where the pressure points were, where their lies lived on paper and where the law could touch them. It would have been easy to smash everything in a fit of rage. Public humiliation, social media posts, a dramatic confrontation that fed the gossip mill. But that would have made me just another noise among the many. I wanted a solution that lasted. I wanted them to feel the cost of monetizing my life in a way that couldn't be swept under a rug with an apology. So I reached out, quietly, to a lawyer who specialized in family finances and coercion, to a financial advisor who knew how to close loopholes and freeze accounts legally, to a therapist who kept me from losing myself in the rage. Each call was small and steady, each appointment a stitch. The support didn't soothe the hurt, nothing could, but it gave me a scaffold. One late night, surrounded by printed bank logs and my own trembling notes, I made a decision. I would not be the family ATM anymore. I would not be the invisible labor that subsidized someone else's entitlement. And I would not surrender my privacy again. Instead of slamming the door and burning bridges for show, I would use the law and the documentation they'd made easy for me. I'd force accountability the way they had forced dependence, with paperwork, with procedure, and with consequences they couldn't gloss over with a charming smile. Rock bottom had done its work. It had cleaned the slate. What rose from it wouldn't be drama. It would be method. Before I move on, and believe me, the next steps are cold and tidy and satisfyingly efficient. Tell me, when your family crosses the line, do you protect them or protect yourself first? Hit subscribe if you haven't and tell me your answer below. Because what comes next isn't yelling. It's a plan. And plans, when executed well, don't need noise to be devastating. Rock bottom had sharpened me. Now it was time to get surgical. I didn't wake up one morning furious and impulsive. I woke up with a list. Quiet, practical, and painfully precise. Revenge wasn't the goal. Correction was. I wanted what they'd stolen back. My privacy, my money, my peace. And I wanted them accountable in a way that wouldn't be erased by a bedtime apology or a charity gala photo op. First, I locked everything down. Not in a dramatic viral post way, in the kind of boring administrative way that actually protects a life. Changed passwords, closed legacy accounts, put new fraud alerts on my credit report. I called banks and asked the hard questions. Who had access, when were transfers made, what signatures existed? The bank clerks were polite. The forms were tedious. The process felt like therapy for someone who had been papered over and ignored for years. Every hold, every freeze, every signed affidavit was a small victory. It felt strangely satisfying to move through paperwork like a surgeon. Next, I hired people who didn't need my emotional backstory to care. A compact legal team with a reputation for quietly suing when corporations whispered, a forensic accountant who could trace money like footprints in snow, and a counselor who taught me to keep my temper out of emails and my heart out of court filings. They called me professional, called them necessary. Then I began to use the very thing they'd weaponized, records, against them. The withdrawals, the transfers to Ryan's accounts, the temporary loans that never returned, the ATM receipts that had been misplaced. I compiled them into a tidy chronology, with dates, screenshots, and witnesses. I turned months of their petty theft into a narrative that read like evidence. It wasn't vindictive. It was factual. That fact, when organized and presented, has its own kind of violence. I didn't expose them on social media. I didn't call talk shows. Instead, I did something quieter and harder. I negotiated consequences that would make them responsible for the mess they'd created. For example, when the bank finally reversed a string of suspicious charges, I asked for a formal remediation plan. Not to get a check and walk away, but to have my mother and Ryan agree in writing to a repayment schedule and financial education classes. It sounds small, but legal obligations force change where guilt rarely can. There was a psychological flip, too. When Mom realized there were forms to sign and witnesses to swear under, she stopped acting like royalty and started acting like someone being asked to account for her choices. Ryan balked at the thought of classes, but when a lawyer explained the consequences of continued fraud, fees, legal records, damaged credit, he suddenly grew very interested in my budget spreadsheets. Suddenly, their entitlement hit the reality of consequences. I also took steps to protect myself going forward. I placed key assets under a legal structure that made casual access impossible. Not to be secretive, but to ensure no one could sign their name and pretend they had permission. I set up automatic payment controls, dual authorization on significant transfers, and a separate emergency fund held in a way that required more than one signature for withdrawal. It was adulting in its coldest form, and it felt like burying a seed for a future when I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. But the most satisfying part wasn't the paperwork. It was watching them do the emotional labor they'd always expected me to perform. My mother had to sit through financial counseling and confront the patterns that had driven my father away and nearly destroyed us all. Ryan had to meet with a job coach and actually apply for positions. They were clumsy at it, awkward and resentful, but change doesn't need elegance. It needs persistence. There were setbacks. A bank delayed a reversal. An invoice went missing. There were nights I questioned whether I'd traded my life for hearings and affidavits. But slowly those paper wounds closed. Money returned. Autonomy re-anchored. And in the quiet mornings, I found myself surprised by how much lighter I felt. I never sought public revenge. I wanted them accountable, not humiliated for strangers' entertainment. The payoff was procedural and permanent. Signed agreements, enforced repayments, therapy sessions attended under contract, and a boundary that had teeth. When they came to me later, awkward, diminished, asking for small kindnesses, I gave what I could on my terms. Not because I'd softened, but because I was finally choosing what generosity looked like. If there's a cruel lesson in all of this, it's that people will always try to turn your life into their safety net if you let them. But there's a kinder truth. You can teach them to stand on their own feet, or you can watch them fall and call it revenge. Chose the former. Felt like justice, it felt like sanity. Before I move on to what changed for them after the agreements were signed, and how the final reconciliation, if there was one, looked, tell me, would you use the law and structure to force accountability, or would you walk away and never look back? Hit subscribe if you haven't and tell me below. Because the next phase isn't loud. It's a quiet new life. And sometimes that's the most devastating ending of all. Execution was never cinematic the way movies show it. There were no dramatic confrontations on a rainy street, no shouting matches with brass-voiced lawyers. There was paper, endless, bureaucratic, unromantic paper, and the slow collapse of entitlement under the weight of rules they'd always thought were for other people. I remember the moment I realized how tiny things add up. A bank form signed carelessly. A verbal, "Oh, just put it on Andrea's card" at a family dinner. Those small permissions had become a habit for them and a liability for me. So I stopped pretending those habits were harmless. I turned them into records. First, the paperwork. I sat with my lawyer in a small conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and old books. We went through the folder I'd built at 3 a.m. over too many sleepless nights. Bank statements, screenshots of messages, copies of transfers with dates, witnesses' notes from neighbors who'd seen Ryan use my card, receipts that didn't match the stories Mom told. The lawyer nodded, not with surprise, but with the clinical satisfaction of someone who knows how to convert chaos into leverage. We opened by sending formal demand letters. Calm, legal, precise. Not emotional pleas, but requests for repayment and restitution, with deadlines and the quiet threat of litigation if ignored. They read like invitations to adult responsibility. My mother gasped when she saw the first one. Ryan swore he'd never sign anything and tried to charm the paralegal. Charm doesn't stand up to a signature notarized in black ink. Next, the bank interventions. Took patience. Some clerks were helpful. Some made me wait in bland rooms with vending machines while they pulled up old logs and asked awkward questions about joint authorizations I never gave. I sat there, polite, collected, and answered each question with dates and documentation until the holds were applied and the fraudulent transfers were reversed or frozen. The bank's compliance unit took an interest when they saw a pattern and started an internal audit. Once the institution's machinery starts turning, it's hard for anyone, no matter the familial ties, to step in and stop it. Then the agreements. Rather than take everything to court and feed tabloids, I insisted on structured remediation. A repayment schedule written by lawyers, financial counseling sessions mandated as part of the agreement, monitored deposits to prove Ryan was actually applying for work, and Mom attended the classes scheduled. It sounded almost kind, and that was intentional. Accountability is merciless when it's done with paperwork, but it's also corrective when it forces education. There was pushback. Mom called me selfish in a voicemail that read like a sermon. Ryan yelled, then apologized the next day, then begged, then disappeared for an hour only to send a passive-aggressive text the following morning. But the signed agreements didn't care about apologies. They only cared about bank transfers and signed receipts and written proof of enrollment in financial management classes. Those are cold things, but they change behavior. I also tightened the legal structure around my assets quietly. Trusts, separate accounts, dual signature requirements for any withdrawal above a small limit. It was boring adulting at its most surgical, but it guaranteed that no one could again add my name to a line they didn't have the right to touch. It felt like a lock on a door I'd left open for too long. There were practical humiliations for them, too. When Mom had to present proof to a financial counselor about her spending habits, she flinched. When Ryan sat, red-faced, in a job center filling out applications with someone watching, his smugness cracked. It wasn't theatrical justice. It was the slow erosion of entitlement by routine. I watched them encounter the systems I'd always navigated alone, and it was a strange, necessary reversal. The media never came knocking. There were no celebratory posts or talk show spotlights. The win here was quiet and domestic. Charges reversed, protections in place, signed commitments to change. I felt relief. Not the vindictive high I'd imagined when I first dreamed of payback, but a steadier thing, the return of my agency. There were nights I questioned if I'd gone too far. Human beings are messy. Family even more so. Forgiveness flickered across my mind like a candle. Could I just write them a check and be done? But the pattern that had cost me years, my time, my sanity, my privacy, wasn't about one payment. It was a structure of entitlement that would have repeated itself if left unchecked. I chose permanence over a temporary fix. One of the most surprising parts of execution was watching change creep in. Not because I forced it by cruelty, but because rules forced them to learn. Mom called me once, voice smaller, saying, "I've been to the class." I learned about budgets. I didn't cheer over the phone. I listened and let a small, cautious something settle in my chest. Ryan sent a message months later. "Got an interview." It was humble, clumsy. It was a start. And while they adjusted, I rebuilt my life on my own terms. I stopped answering calls when I knew they were about bills. I set office hours for family time. My generosity returned, but this time it was on a contract. Mutual respect, documented assistance, and limits with teeth. Before I move on to the aftermath, the small, human reckonings and the way our home life began to warp back towards something healthier. Tell me this. If someone you love treated your success like an entitlement, would you use the law to make them responsible, or would you walk away and never help again? Hit subscribe if you're still with me, and tell me in the comments, team accountability or team cut and run. Because the next part isn't a headline. It's daily life, slow, ordinary, and quietly satisfying. The confrontation wasn't dramatic in the way movies show it. There was no shouting match in the street. No door slamming that echoed for blocks. It was quiet, precise, and it carried weight because it was unavoidable. Mom came to my apartment one evening, her heels clicking on the hardwood. Ryan lingered behind, arms crossed, expression tight. They thought I'd shy away, that I'd give in when faced with a familiar combination of guilt, nostalgia, and expectation. I didn't. "You mean the repayment schedule you drafted for us?" Mom asked, her voice brittle. "Yes," I said calmly. "The one that ensures Ryan completes the program and you attend the sessions we agreed on. I also set up the dual signature account for any future transfers. Everything's documented." Mom's lips pressed together. I could see her calculating. She'd tried manipulation all her life, but numbers, contracts, deadlines, they weren't abstract. They were facts. Ryan's jaw tightened. "So, what? You're really not helping without the forms?" I'm helping exactly as agreed, I said. Not 1 cent more, not 1 day less. That's the difference between generosity and enabling. Mom shook her head. Andrea, I raised you. You can't treat your family like this. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice soft but firm. I know what you raised me for. You raised me to handle responsibility. And now I'm making sure responsibility is applied evenly. The rules that protect me also teach you. That's the difference between a parent and a user. Ryan scoffed, muttering something about being the only adult here. I didn't react. I let the silence fill the space. The pressure of expectation, entitlement, and unearned confidence was collapsing around them quietly, like the slow cracking of ice under weight. Then Mom tried a final tactic, tears. The silent, practiced kind that implies betrayal if you refuse them. I looked at her for a long moment and thought about every empty fridge, every borrowed dollar, every unspoken debt she'd piled on me for 26 years. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said. But I'm done feeling guilty for your choices. That stops now. This is the line. She faltered, the perfect storm of shock, pride, and forced compliance hitting all at once. Ryan slumped slightly, realizing the same. The confrontation wasn't loud, but it was final. They were accountable. And the structures I'd set in motion meant that trying to manipulate me further was impossible. That night I didn't celebrate. I just felt relief. Not victory exactly. Just a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The confrontation wasn't revenge. It was boundary setting. It was reclaiming autonomy. And for the first time my success felt like mine, not a currency for someone else's comfort. Before we move on to the next phase, the ultimate justice, where their long-term reckoning begins. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to confront a family member and enforce boundaries that made them uncomfortable? How did it feel? Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because what comes next is the final layer of karma, and it's quietly devastating. Justice, in my experience, didn't arrive as a headline or a dramatic courtroom monologue. It arrived like compound interest, slow, inevitable, and impossible to ignore once it started to build. After the confrontation, the paperwork I'd pushed into motion began to do its quiet work. The demand letters were no longer theoretical threats. Banks started calling my mother for documentation she couldn't produce. The financial counselor emailed proof of attendance forms that she'd signed under pressure. Ryan's requirement to show job applications and meet with a career coach meant his past habit of borrowing money without consequence could no longer slide. The first domino fell where it hurts most. Credibility. My mother had always traded on reputation. A few sympathetic neighbors, the right birthday guests, the casual name-dropping that made people assume stability. When the restitution schedule appeared in black and white, when the counselor's notes found their way into a small local paper through an anonymous tip, that carefully curated image cracked. People started to speak differently to her. Invitations dwindled. Coffee mornings stopped. The same small-town niceties that had smoothed over bad behavior for years evaporated because contracts and signatures don't lie. The bank's audit flagged patterns that were ugly and precise. Transfers labeled as gifts to Ryan, multiple ATM withdrawals matching social dates. The old joint account signatures people assumed were family conveniences. With my lawyer's help, those transfers were reclassified. Some of the more egregious transactions were reversed under consumer protection statutes. The bank required my mother to agree to a remediation plan. They'd freeze certain lines of credit until restitution began and would report suspicious activity to the credit bureaus. Her interest rates climbed. A small business credit card she had relied on was cut. Privilege, it turned out, had a monthly fee. There was also administrative fallout at a place I never thought would matter. Ryan's social circles. The men who had once lent him small sums as investments suddenly frowned when he mentioned needing bridge loans. A former client who'd tolerated his late deliveries stopped returning his emails after a frank conversation with their accountant. The consequence was prosaic but lethal for someone who'd lived on charm and borrowed time. Contracts were cancelled, and his business dried up faster than he could text sorry. One afternoon, a notice arrived at my mother's apartment. The landlord was issuing an eviction warning for unpaid rent stretching back 3 months. She'd assumed my support would continue, and when it didn't, bills accumulated. Suddenly, the house that had been a stage for manipulation felt very small. She called me in a panic, voice frayed, asking if there was anything I could do. I answered with a calendar. The remediation schedule, the next bank meeting, the date she'd signed for counseling. I offered to help, on the terms we agreed. Not a check handed over in secret, not a one-time cover-up, but help that required work, proof, and responsibility. That, more than the frozen accounts or the credit hits, was the point. I didn't want to crush them into ruin. I wanted them to rebuild honestly. The restitution plan required them to pay reasonable amounts back over time and to document attempts at change. It forced apologies into action rather than letting them sit empty in a voicemail. There were moments of cruelty I didn't relish. When my mother called in tears and I heard the raggedness in her admission, I was scared to be poor again. I felt a small, complicated tenderness. But I also remembered the nights I'd missed sleep to send money so she could keep a roof over her head. I remembered Ryan's laughter when I'd tightened my belt. Empathy didn't mean erasing the lesson. In public they flinched. Neighbors who'd once waved politely now looked away. A cousin who'd been casual with invitations avoided family dinners. News of the remediation plan filtered through the social grapevine like cold wind. The most satisfying part was not schadenfreude. It was the knowledge that they could no longer weaponize my generosity without a paper trail that would hold in court and in life. The legal architecture I'd put around my assets held too. Joint account snares were cut. Dual signature requirements prevented sudden withdrawals. Automated notifications meant I saw any attempt to access funds before it happened. I watched the account alerts on my phone like a hawk, not because I wanted to punish, but because I'd finally decided I deserved to sleep without checking my balance 3 times a night. And there were small human victories. Ryan's first pay stub, clumsily photographed and sent to me with the text, "It's a start." Mom's first honest budgeting spreadsheet, the one she'd filled out in shame and with trembling hands. No grand gestures, just steady movement toward competence. They were messy, reluctant, and imperfect, but real. The community's reaction surprised me. A neighbor I'd once barely known, Mrs. Alvarez from 3B, brought over a casserole and a small handwritten note. "Good on you for making them learn." That took courage. People I'd lost to gossip slowly came back to simple civilities. That, perhaps, was the most unexpected form of justice. That my life, once policed by whispers, could be measured in normal, uncomplicated interactions again. There were also legal reminders that justice is not a novelty. My mother filed a protest at first, an emotional plea dressed as a legal appeal, but it crumbled under the weight of the signed documents, the bank logs, and the council's notes. Her credit rating took the hit. Slow, bureaucratic, then permanent enough to require effort to mend. Ryan's name appeared on a commercial ledger marked delinquent. He felt the pinch in the way most entitled people feel it. Embarrassment, then action. I never made their pain performative. I refused to stream their embarrassment for likes or to weaponize it as entertainment. My aim had never been humiliation. It was accountability. The contracts, the classes, the repayments. These were the scaffolding that allowed them, in time, to stand without leaning on me. Months later, there was a small, private reckoning. A family dinner with rules. No phones at the table. No financial talk unless it was about progress reports. And a calendar pinned to the fridge with counseling dates and job applications. They came begrudgingly, then with a hint of routine, and finally with something that looked suspiciously like responsibility. It wasn't fast. It wasn't cinematic. It was work. There were moments I still wrestled with the cost. Watching a mother who once used shame as leverage sit through tiny, humiliating classes in budgeting was an ache I hadn't expected. But then I'd think of my 20s. Sacrifices, missed chances, a private ledger of nights I'd traded for their present comfort, and the ache would harden into purpose. I had turned their greed into soil that might, one day, grow something better. One quiet evening, as winter thinned and the city smelled like thawing concrete, my mother stopped by with a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "I'm learning. Thank you for not turning away." It was a fragile thing, a first draft of apology. I folded it into my wallet and felt something like closure, though the word never fit neatly into what we'd done. Closure suggested an ending. Our work here had been the start of a longer, slower repair. In the end, the ultimate justice wasn't a dramatic public ruin. It was a structural recalibration. Contracts, signatures, reverse transfers, mandatory classes, and economic consequences that forced honesty where deception had been the default. It was walking past my mother's apartment and no longer hearing the small, corrosive voice that used to tell me I wasn't enough. It was watching Ryan fill out an application form without being propped up by someone else's money. Before I move on to the resolution, my life after all of this and the small choices that finally felt like freedom. Tell me, would you rather your family face consequences and learn, or walk away and never look back? Drop your answer below and hit subscribe if you're still with me, because the final phase is a quiet kind of peace that makes everything worth it. The thing about real endings is they rarely look like endings at all. They look like mornings that aren't as sharp as they used to be. Like bills that are paid on time without a pit in your stomach. Like a calendar that says therapy alongside team meeting and both feel normal. After the remediation plans were signed and the bank freezes were in place, life didn't explode into applause. There were no victory laps. There were small, stubborn repairs, the kind that require patience rather than headlines. I went back to work. Slowly at first. My desk felt smaller and safer, because the people who mattered there now knew more about me than the gossip had allowed. Projects came and went. I threw myself into work not to hide, but because design and numbers are honest things. They demand time, attention, proof. My promotion didn't arrive like a coronation. It arrived as a routine email saying my role had expanded and with it, more responsibility, and slightly more pay. It felt quietly earned. Home became a different kind of sanctuary. I redecorated not to prove anything, but to make a space that reflected who I'd chosen to be. Practical, calm, unshowy. The noise of family crises became a scheduled rhythm rather than a constant hum. Visits happened with pre-planned boundaries, phone calls had time limits, and any financial conversation required documentation before a word was spoken. It was clinical at times, but clinical is safer than chaos. Mom and Ryan didn't transform overnight. The classes they attended were boring at times and humiliating at others. There were evenings when my mother called sobbing because confronting her spending meant admitting long patterns of avoidance. There were weeks when Ryan ghosted appointments and then returned sheepish with job applications to show. The remediation plan didn't make them saints. It made them smaller, more ordinary. And for now, ordinary was enough. I offered help on terms I could live with. An emergency fund existed, yes, not for daily needs, but for real emergencies, and it required proof, receipts, and a signed explanation. That felt merciful and reasonable. If they asked for more, I referred them to the counselor or reminded them of the repayment schedule. Generosity without boundaries had been my first mistake. Generosity with rules was my new discipline. Emotionally, the scars remained. Some nights I'd wake with the old guilt, the reflex to apologize even when I had done nothing wrong. Sometimes I'd catch myself scrolling through old texts and feel the old ache of expectation. But those moments faded faster than before because I had given myself something I'd never had, a framework to protect my peace. There were surprises along the way. Neighbors who had once whispered now nodded in the elevator. A woman from downstairs who had once avoided eye contact brought over homemade soup and a short, honest apology for how she'd jumped to conclusions. Small civility returned, the kind that doesn't require explanation. Proof that living well sometimes rewrites the rumor mill more effectively than confrontation ever could. Romance. That happened slowly and awkwardly like everything else. I dated in small doses. Coffee dates that stayed under 2 hours, long walks that didn't end in confessions. Trust was a cautious experiment. I let people in inch by inch and kept the parts of me that had been used firmly behind a locked door until those people proved they knew how to knock. Professionally, I set new rules. Any joint financial activity had layers of approvals. I built savings into separate accounts and automated payments so there was no temptation for me or anyone else to take shortcuts. I taught myself the language of wills and trusts in late-night webinars and joked about it later at brunch with friends. Adulting felt less like a chore and more like armor. As for my mother, the note she left in my wallet months earlier became a bookmark in a book I was actually reading. We had an honest dinner one evening, not a negotiation. No ledger, no expectations. She apologized in a way that had finally left off performative guilt and arrived at accountability. I accepted it as a start, not a finish. Forgiveness, I learned, is a long contract with many clauses. Ryan showed up with a pay stub one rainy Tuesday. He was clumsy about pride. A text at first, then a short call. He said, "I'm trying." That's all anyone can really ask for sometimes. The small verb of trying. I didn't throw open the doors or hand over cash. I sent him a list of local jobs and a contact for the job coach he'd been expected to see. He called once in 6 months to say thanks. Sometimes old anger surfaced. Once, at a family event, an aunt muttered the old line about what money does to people. I looked at her and felt the old urge to roar. Instead, I nodded and smiled. The calm felt harder and more satisfying than any outburst would have. There were practical victories that mattered more than a triumphant tweet. My credit remained intact. The account protections held. I slept without waking to check overnight notifications. I could take a weekend trip without wondering if someone had found an excuse to siphon funds. In the quiet calculus of daily life, these were the wins that counted. Occasionally I'd think about the girl who worked double shifts at 17, the one who believed silence would save us. I would whisper to her not apologies but thanks, for the grit, for the nights she kept the lights on. She made this possible. In the end, the most realistic ending wasn't a cinematic revenge or a cinematic reconciliation. It was a life that looked ordinary again, punctuated by therapy appointments, scheduled family visits, a budgeting app we all finally learned to use, and the soft, steady knowledge that I could say no and still be loved at the edges. If you've been with me through this, tell me, would you set the same boundaries even if it meant being called cold? Or would you give until there's nothing left? Drop your answer below. And if you believe in building a life on your terms, hit subscribe, because the next story will remind you how ordinary courage changes everything. They tried to make my success their safety net. I turned it into a map that showed the way out.